Hello, everyone. So I'm really excited to invite on stage Paul Midi and Polina Vasilenko. We're going to be talking about how to scale high-impact companies, so touching upon cases like Northvolt and other failures that happen over the year, and see what we can learn from that to scale climate tech and impact companies in Series B and above. So like, how do we get to IPO? How do we get to M&A? What do we need to do from a government perspective? And also from a more startup investor perspective. So my name's Helena Wasserman. I'm co-founder of Investors for Climate. We are a community of 400 climate investors in 24 cities. And we do two things. We educate investors to do climate deals locally in 24 cities. We're going to be in 40 cities by Christmas, if everything goes according to plan, which rarely does, but hopefully that will work out. And we also have an investment syndicate arm, so we do some investments ourselves as well. And I'm going to invite Polina on stage. Polina is an environmental entrepreneur with 2 master's degrees in chemistry and ocean renewable energy. She's originally from Russia and came to Germany actually to study renewable energy. And she started a company. She was also in oil and gas for a long time at Schlumberger. And she launched a French floating solar technology called Heliorec. So I'm excited to welcome Polina. And we're also going to be joined by Paul, who just arrived, bang on time. Paul Midi, you might be familiar with, is a French politician and former tech executive. He was a partner at McKinsey for 7 years. And then he held leadership roles in startups like Jumia, and he was CEO of Frishti as well. And more recently, he became part of the French National Assembly. As you will understand a little bit later, and you may already know, he advocates a lot for innovation and entrepreneurship. Welcome. I'm excited for this conversation. Can everybody hear me well enough? Yes. Good. OK, cool. Perfect. So before we dive into this very interesting and complex topic, we're going to start a little lightly. Is there something that Google doesn't know about you that you would like to share with the audience? Polina.
Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here. Maybe Google doesn't know that I am the professional diver. I dived to 100 meters. I visited 71 countries. I lived in 5 of them, but I choose to live in the best country in the world, in France.
Yes. Can everybody hear her?
This message.
Great. And just small note, Heliorec, we are building floating solar power plants. We manufacture our floating system in France. So I came to France, we started to manufacture our product locally, and we are happy to support local economy.
Thank you. And Paul, are you allowed to say any of this?
Of course. As a politician, I'm not sure Google doesn't know something about me. But I like to cook, and I have a very special signature meal, which is a Greek salad. So I master the Greek salad. So anytime you want to eat a good Greek salad, come home.
Well, great to hear. Nice to know a little bit of personal things about you before we dive into your professional opinions. So we'll start with Paul. So obviously, Paul, you've worked both as a startup executive and you're now a legislator. What do you think is getting in the middle of scaling climate tech in France and Europe? And what have you put in place so far to make that happen?
I would say innovation and funding for innovation. If you listen to the IPCC, they say we miss 50% of the innovation to be able to do the net zero carbon in 2050. So we need, of course, we innovate a lot, but we need even more innovation, and we need to put them at scale. So we need a lot of money to finance this. So I'm working specifically on this topic, on how do you finance innovation, how do you finance startup in France and in Europe. Give you 2 examples, very concrete. First one, that we implemented into the law in France. So we to make it simple, copy-paste a very good system which is working great, which has been working great for 30 years in the United Kingdom, SEIS EIS, for the one in the room who knows it. It's a fiscal incentive for individuals who wants to invest in startup, and they get a fiscal incentive, so it reduces their tax very concretely. So this has been implemented 1 year and a half now. I know that it has already generated several hundreds of millions of euros of additional funding for our startups, created several thousand jobs, which is of course important. It's a good shot, it's a small shot, but now I'm working on I would say the big shot for France, which is we need pension funds in France. We almost have no pension fund in France. It's 100 billion euro in pension fund in France. If you look at Europe as a whole, it's 6,000 billion euro, sorry. But in US, you have 42,000 billion euro in pension funds. So of course, there are way more money to invest into innovation. So we need to work on it. And my objective is that we decide collectively as a democracy in France in 2027, is the next presidential election, to push part of our pension system to a capital-funded pension system.
That's brilliant. I lived in the UK for a while, and I remember it was back in 2014, and the startup ecosystem was super strong because of that incentive. So great. Since when has that been?
First January of 2024.
Okay.
So it's very new.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm still advertising about it.
Yes.
If you have money, you are an individual, you want to invest in startups, you can reduce your tax. If you are an entrepreneur in early stage, you can find people to whom you can reduce tax and have more money from.
That's really good to hear. And on the pension funds as well, and it's going to boost also the M&A market and
it's obviously a long shot. It takes one generation to build a capital funding pension fund system, but we need to begin as soon as possible. And it can have a great impact. I will propose a system where at least we will push 10 billion euros per year in a pension fund, a collective pension fund, which means that in 5 years you will have, with the interest, 60, 70 billion in a pension fund. It's very small compared to all the figures I gave you, but it's already bigger than BPI France, right. 55 billion euro, or France 2030, our program of innovation program, which is around 54 billion euro. So with pension fund, you can really change the dimension of funding, and this is what we are missing in France and in Europe.
Wonderful. These are indeed powerful incentives. Now we're going to turn to Paulina, who comes from a different angle, right? She's an entrepreneur. She's building a company from the ground up, right? And you've actually been successful at raising capital for a hardware climate tech startup, which is one of the hardest things to do, they say. So I'd be curious to hear what has been, I would say, like the top 3 obstacles that you said, oof, I might not make it, but obviously you did. But could you remind us a little bit, what you've been going through to see how we can support you?
I think I can do everything.
Clearly.
But about the obstacles, from a startup point of view, lack of finance. And the second obstacle is difficult to attract and keep the talents in the company, especially if you cannot pay big salary like people have in McKinsey. And in terms of renewable energy implementation in France and I believe in Europe, in my opinion, we have 3 obstacles, what is great to overcome in the nearest future. So the first one is the process obtaining the permit to build renewable energy project. It can take for medium-sized project between 1 to 5 years. Obviously for startups, we don't have this time to wait once we start build. Second obstacle, currently energy tariffs quite low, for example, for solar power. It was 120 euro per megawatt hour. Currently, it's dropped to 80 or 90. Maybe 5 years ago it was 200. So again, you started company, and it's very difficult to build sustainable business model for your renewable energy project. And the last obstacle, I would say, on the government level, it will be great to support local supply chain, because our customers are driven by low price from China. And as we are manufacture our floating system in Brittany, it's a little bit more expensive than Chinese product. But if government will find a great mechanism to support local supply chain, it will make easier for startup to scale.
Can everybody hear Polina? Yeah. Okay, great. So obviously you've touched upon funding, upon low tariffs, upon supply chain issues. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention?
Once you have your startup, every day is many obstacles. So it's, I can tell you
Yeah, there's many more.
many strange stories, and but we will overcome everything, no worries.
Before we go to Paul, I'd be curious to hear, what do you think about that from your perspective?
No, it's of course very coherent with what has just been said. What I am working on at the moment is a kind of a pact with our startups and company with 3 topics. First, a reduction of our productive tax. So the productive tax are quite high in France. They are higher than in Germany, for example. Productive tax is a tax that are on the cost of the company, not on the profit of the company, which is it's the most terrible, most idiot tax in the world. So we want to reduce it. Second one is a pact on energy to guarantee for the next 10 years electricity decarbonated, of course, in France, below 50 euros per megawatt-hour. And an acceleration of the process to connect, which I was working on just yesterday with RTE, our main operator in France, to connect all the companies to electricity. And third one is specific territories where startup and companies could implement and grow with a very clear administrative fast track. So not only on electricity, but on all the permits. Of course, we don't want to, maybe I think we will discuss the regulation. We have many regulations, but behind every regulation, there is a purpose, there is a meaning. So it's not about killing every regulation. It's about making sure that in some part of our country, where we have decided we will do clear fast track, some regulation will be taken down to make sure that you will be able to do a project in 1-2 years and not in 3, 4, 5 years. And those territories will be called territory of growth acceleration. Voilà.
Wonderful. Polina, are there any, with all the things you're going through, are there any stories that you want to share with us that, you had to go through? And if not, is there anything that, in your journey that you've scaled? Were there any moments that you had to make some pivotal decisions that got you where you are today? I remember we talked about supply chain decisions and so on. Could you walk the audience through some of these so that we can, put ourselves in your shoes? What does it take to build a solar company in France today?
I think it's not about my decisions. It's about the results of your hard work, and every achievement what you have, it drives you further to achievements in terms of implementation of the good technologies and make this world a better place. For example, in my case, it was acceptance in the Techstars accelerator. It was some investment. The second achievement was we raised seed round. So once you see that other people believe in you, if you see the first customers come to you and they buy our floaters and not Chinese floaters, so this gives you extra energy and okay, I can do more, I can go further. So it's not about decision, it's just your hard work, you get result, this result drive you achieve more and bring more and more the positive impact.
Well, it's very impressive. And for anyone who's thinking about starting a solar company or hardware company, definitely come speak to Polina. Or if you have any investors that are looking to support her, she's doing a great job, and I've been following her since our time at Techstars already a few years ago. So congratulations. Our next question is what we call the $1 billion question, which I'm going to ask both of you. So it's very simple, but if you were given $1 billion, and Paul said, this is not a lot, when am I going to do it?
For me, it's a lot.
What would you do? How would you spend $1 billion in public finance today? Where would it go? How would you think about it?
So I would answer to you that 1 billion is not enough. I'm advocating at the moment for the next step of our France 2030 plan to make it France 2050 plan with 100 billion euros. So I will stick to that number, 100 billion.
Okay.
But to answer your question, I would put it once. I would look, of course, I look at where we generate carbon, where we know already the solution, and it's only about implementation, and where we still need innovation. And then I would put it one third on nuclear energy and other energies. Of course, small and medium reactors, of course, hydrogen, but I wouldn't miss also fusion, nuclear fusion. So I think we should accelerate on this, and it should be. I hope it would be in our plan. It's a moonshot, but for 2050. So one third on this, one third on decarbonation of our industry. So all you need to do to decarbonate, except of course the change of energy, and one third on transportation, of course, electric cars and low carbon / zero carbon planes. I'm very excited about innovation like the one supported by Beyond Aero, which is a French startup. It has built a small plane, hydrogen, which flew in France last year. So of course it was a prototype, but they want it to be commercialized around 2030. So I think we should accelerate on this and push. The way we see ecological transition, and the one I'm advocating for is not travel anymore, and we stop using the planes, but we make the planes zero carbon, and we need to push for it. I believe in it, and let's put more money on this.
Wonderful. Well, I love that it changed now. Everything's focused on solutions. Everything is focused on looking ahead and how can we keep growing, but repair the planet at the same time. So thank you for that. Very interesting. Paulina, from your entrepreneur perspective, you're in the trenches, you have your solar company. What would you do if you had $1 billion?
Obviously, I love my floating system. I would like to build a factory in Brittany and make our beautiful floaters in France. As well, I think it's good to support the solar industry. I have panels not from China, but locally. So one plant for floaters, one plant for the solar panels, make together and build the floating solar power plants and generate a clean energy.
I agree, and sorry to,
Continue.
because you were talking before about the protection we should set in place on our industry. So it's something I think very important, and it's a way also to make sure that some types of industries stay in France or in Europe, or we make sure that they come back to France and Europe, and renewable energy I think is definitely should be in the process of it.
Yeah, definitely. So we need to attract more talents and keep all technologies, all industry in Europe.
And when we were on our preparation call for this panel, Paulina, you talked a little bit about supply chain and the decision you had to make to either, build your solar panels in China or have them here locally. Obviously, there's a big conversation right now around the world. Can you just walk us through what you had to do and the decision you made?
Obviously, we sell our power plants, and the customer have some budget, and we need to be within this budget. So, and we have a choice to buy Chinese panels 3 times cheaper or buy it in Europe. For example, for one of our project in Brestport, we bought it from Slovenia, but the price is 3 times more expensive. So for next project, we bought it from China because we just could not make it in the budget. So this is a problem what we already discussed. But for all our supply chain, as much as we can, we manufacture it here, and it's okay. For the solar panels, it's still a big issue how we're gonna get cheaper products in Europe. So, but I think it will be very good, for example, if you have energy tariffs high, if you say 90% of the power plant manufactured in Europe, we buy your electricity at higher price. If your power plant Chinese made, with the Chinese components, make it electricity price low. So maybe it will be drive our customers build from local products. It can be one of the idea of implement.
Yeah, it's a bit the same idea when we make sure that when we give money to individuals for them to go from an old car to an electric car, before we are paying for any cars, and mostly coming from China. Now we're paying only for European cars. So it's those type of rules. We need to be clever, but set them in place because the world has changed. We were building, and I was part of this, building an open world. I'm not for tariffs. I'm for globalization. But Americans, they choose another world now, which is America first. Chinese, they were already in a world where it's China first. It's their decision, so we need to react and to be clever, so we need to do it also.
Wonderful. And so we only have 2 minutes left, so some quick questions, rapid fire questions. Paulina, what keeps you up at night?
Usually I sleep well.
Paul, anything that keeps you up at night?
Sorry?
What keeps you up at night?
So I'm a lucky guy because I sleep well? I sleep very well. But still to answer your question, I would say, really, is democracy the winning system? Will European defense ready on time? So this could keep me up at night, but to be very optimistic, because I'm a very optimistic guy, I'm very optimistic about ecological transition. When I see that we have a plan, and when I see that all the young people in at least my country, but I think the same in Europe, they have climate challenge at the top of their agenda, we will make it happen. So I'm very optimistic. I'm an eco-enthusiast, and I'm fighting against eco-anxiety. So
that's why you're here at Change Now.
Exactly.
That's why we invited you to speak. Great to hear such an audience and speakers that are all, working for the solutions, and that's what we're all talking about here at Change Now. Last question before I let you go. What gets you up in the morning?
For me, a new day, new opportunity. We need to search and achieve new results in the new day.
Thank you.
Me, the same. The same I just mentioned, honestly. I'm a positive guy, so I'm more about waking up to fight on the topic I just mentioned than not sleeping at night. So.
Wonderful. Well, that's why you're getting so much done, because you get to sleep well and you're not too worried and you're just getting things done. So thank you so much for the work you do, both of you, and for being here on stage with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, go. I stay, you go. On stage, we're going to welcome a woman who's actually from the US, living in Germany. And she's quite unusual because she's worked for a lot of different investors. So Morgan Sheil is head of impact at World Fund, which is one of the first growth impact funds in Europe. And she previously worked with KKR, the private equity group. And she's done a lot of investing with that group as well in terms of decarbonization. She's decarbonized the whole portfolio. She also holds a degree of Harvard Business School, University of Cambridge, and University of Maryland. So I'm really excited to welcome Morgan on stage. Come over. I think we're waiting. There's always that awkward when we're waiting for the music. But yes, there she is. Thank you so much, Morgan, for joining me today. before we get started, we're going to the nitty-gritty of all the questions that we have that we're going to dive into. Wanted to talk a little bit about your experience in Germany, being a New Yorker, right? I'm Swiss, I live in New York. She is from New York, lives in Berlin, and we were talking about innovation in general. And can you tell us a little bit what has been your experience in terms of working in innovation in the US and coming to Europe just recently, right? You moved to Germany when?
About 1.5 years ago.
Okay. I would just be curious to hear what you've been through.
Yeah, I mean, first I'll say the entrepreneurs are the same, all brilliant, all hardworking, diligent, etc. But the reaction to to entrepreneurs and people who are trying to innovate is very different. In the US, there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement around that. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of negativity or concern offered to entrepreneurs in Europe. So I think that there's opportunity there for us to be a bit more excited and happy. And it's not just a cultural thing, it's also structural. I mean, when you look at what it takes, I think to incorporate a business in Germany, it takes weeks, which is insane. Whereas in the US, and I think maybe London, it takes like a day. And so I think there's definitely opportunities for us to, support entrepreneurs and their vision a bit more, not just from a funding perspective, but from an excitement and encouragement perspective.
And this is just a little second, but I had exactly the same experience being in the US. People always ask me, what can we learn from Europe? And I was like, actually, there's something we can learn for you guys here. Is that everybody wants to work together. It's not like, should we work together? It's like, how can we work together? How can we make this work? How can we support each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think the attitude around failure is also just very different. In the US, having started a company and then having failed is considered a good thing. Like, I've been in hiring rooms where that's a positive. They're saying, oh, they're going to have so much learnings, they're going to have so much knowledge. That's really valuable. Whereas I think in Germany, if you are a director in a company that goes bankrupt, I think there's like several years where you can't be a director in another company again, which is wild to me.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, as we think about scaling and how do we scale these companies, that is a question that is super important, right? So if you invest in an entrepreneur that has already, tried a company, say, up to Series B and failed, or up to Series A and failed, that's actually something positive, that it might be better at the second one. Wonderful. And so, as we were saying when I was introducing you, waiting for you on stage, you've worked for VCs, you've worked for private equity, and now you're head of impact. What do you think is missing right now from your investor perspective, obviously overseeing a lot of portfolio companies? What do you think is missing to scale European climate tech?
Yeah, I'll say, first thing we have to look at is not just the companies themselves, but is their infrastructure setting them up for success in terms of fundraising, in terms of being able to access capital? And I think that to scale startups and to scale climate tech, we need to also scale the investment infrastructure we're seeing. So when you look at the funds that exist in Europe, overwhelmingly they are so much smaller than they are in other parts of the world. They're not that raising 100 million euros is not impressive. It is so impressive and a very difficult feat. But if you're a 100 million fund, I'd say most funds are ranging from 80 million to 150 million. If that's the size of your fund, you can't write a check for larger Series A, Series B companies. So there's a lot of companies getting to the Series B standpoint, especially in climate tech where check sizes need to be bigger. There's infrastructure you need to build. There's hardware that's, often these are not software plays. These are tough tech, hard tech solutions. They need to go out and build factories. And as they're trying to do that, they need to fundraise large check sizes. And we're seeing a situation where in Europe, there's not enough larger size funds that can even just risk that check size or hold that check size. And so what we're seeing is a lot of US investors or Asian investors come in and fund that opportunity. And I think there's something that we really have to work on in Europe is growing those larger funds, because I think that will actually help climate tech scale much, much faster.
Right, because if you look at the funds landscape right now, there's a lot of these kind of early stage funds, but there's not many that are doing Series B and above, right?
Yeah, I mean, but that goes down into their investment strategy, goes down to the size of their fund, because if they're doing later stage, those are larger check sizes. And if they're a $100 million fund, they can't write a check for 20 million to one company because it's too much risk concentrated down in their fund. So, it's too risky for them and for their LPs. And so I think the structure and size of your fund dictates your investment strategy. And so that's why we see in Europe so many early stage investors and so few later stage. It really comes down to that fund size.
That's an excellent point. And in your portfolio at the World Fund, how many investments have you done, or has this fund done,
I think we've got about 18 public investments.
Got it. And these are all which stage?
Yeah, so we invest from seed to Series B.
Okay, got it. And you've been now overseeing the impact portfolio, so supporting portfolio companies with their impact journey. Can you tell us a few stories of portfolio companies that you're overseeing that you're proud of?
Yeah, so I think the companies I'll tell you about are the ones we've been with a little bit longer, who are a little bit further in their journey. So it's a little bit juicier and there's more excitement because we've really grown with them and seen them grow. So the first I'll talk about is Planet A Foods. So they're a chocolate substitute. And so we invested in them in 2021, and they have scaled their operations in a really impressive way. So I don't know if any of you know, but the price of chocolate, not only is chocolate emittive, there's deforestation, there's massive climate change risks, but the price of chocolate has also skyrocketed. And so they've really captured that opportunity to step in as a chocolate alternative. And it's been really impressive. What they've done a really good job of is in building their FOAK, building their capacity for production. They've really targeted being a B2B supplier. So they're not selling you, the consumer, a direct chocolate bar, the chocolate in your cereal, the chocolate on your popcorn, the chocolate that you're buying for Easter, or the chocolate in cookies that you're getting on the train as like a free gift. That's what they're targeting, which is a really big market and opportunity. And they've really done a good job at leveraging their technology, but also experience and partnerships in the existing industry. Mm-hmm. So there was a lab space that they were able to get for like 1/10 of what it would have cost them to build it up naturally, because they were really well networked into the system. Whenever they're running into scale-up problems, they're really good at finding solutions and partnering with people in the industry. The second company I'll say is Silas.
What stage was this company at?
B.
B.
Yeah. We invested earlier, obviously,
Yeah.
but it's been a couple of years. And so the other company I'll talk about is Silib, which is battery recycling at industrial speed. So they were lab tabletop, and in less than a year, they went from lab to pre-industrial pilot scale, and now they're just launching their FOAK. So they're building their first of a kind industrial production, and they haven't yet entered that complete FOAK stage. They're just launching it now, but it's been really impressive, and the work they've done and the technical expertise they have around that is really impressive. They're seeing really good yields. They're seeing really good flexibility in terms of what kinds of batteries they can recycle. And so it's really exciting, because we think it's not just producing new products, but it's also finding ways to reuse and repurpose existing technologies, especially for batteries where there's rare earth metals. So it's so important that we not just be throwing away things that are actually very valuable.
Absolutely. That's actually a good segue into our next question, which is about Northvolt, right? We've been thinking about that a lot. That was the largest battery company in Europe, billions of dollars invested from a lot of big institutional investors that failed. What are the internal conversations that you're having, with your peers at your fund about, what went wrong? What could you prevent your portfolio companies to do? Can you walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I'll say is I think it's really important. Companies should be aiming to raise the minimum amount of money they need to be successful. It should not be trying to maximize that valuation number so that they can be at the top of an email listserv and stroke their ego, which is maybe a rough way to say it, but I think it's really important. It's like you want to be raising the minimum amount and giving away as little value as you can as a founder. And I think that we've seen a lot of companies, and I think Northvolt fell foul of this a little bit, trying to grow too quickly and overextending themselves and ultimately facing failure, or being unable to raise the follow-on funding that they need. Like, there's a reason why VC is structured the way it is a stepwise approach, and I think that that's pretty important. So one, I would say, be thoughtful about what you're fundraising. Just because you can get a higher valuation doesn't necessarily mean you should, because sometimes that might also not be the most informed investor. Like, we've had situations where if we miss on a deal because we offered a valuation that was like 15% too low, we're frustrated and upset by that. But if we've missed deals by 100+% of valuation, and at that point we're like, okay, there's some kind of mismatch or problem here, because I don't know how that they can justify getting there without placing undue burden on the company. The next thing I'll say is, there's a lot of companies, at least very much in the climate tech space, that are going from PhD, lab research, and then trying to start operating and executing. Most important thing for them is to hire experienced hires in the industry, especially for sales, especially for ops. They need to be hiring people who have expertise in operating, and founders can't try to do it all. Because when they try to do it all, that's where we see, like, if a founder is a PhD and is a visionary and is a technical person, that's amazing, and we want them to operate in their sweet spot. We don't necessarily want them going and then trying to do sales and trying to do ops in a space where they've not done a sales cycle or they've not operated. So we think hiring experts and hiring people who have that expertise is so clear and key, and especially for operations. Like with Northvolt, I'd say there were a lot of strategic and operational choices that were made that ultimately resulted in what we saw. I don't think it's endemic to the entire industry, but I do think it's a learning lesson for founders to take. And the last thing I'd say is, putting my head of impact hat on, is I think founders need to also think through impact and emission savings and what is the result of the solution they're selling, because that's part of their value add. Like, that is part of what they're selling at the end of the day for most climate founders. And if you don't get a good handle on that, you're leaving not only value on the table, but we're shifting from a qualitative into a quantitative world, so you have to have quantitative numbers on that, just like you have to have quantitative numbers on your solution.
Definitely. And I like what you said about, it's not necessarily the same people that will be starting a company versus scaling it. It's a very different types of people that you're looking for, which is important.
And that's not to say that the founder's vision isn't necessary. It's so necessary. It's so important. Like, the founder is integral to every stage of the growth for their company. But part of growing up and part of scaling up is that you have to have people who are experts in what they do, own what they do.
Exactly. I mean, there's the startup people who are good at building something from nothing, and then there's other types of people that can be industry experts that can actually scale and have relationships with corporates and other things that will be really relevant to scale. So thanks for touching upon that.
Especially with sales, just because, if you're trying to sell corporate or you're trying to sell, into utilities or industry, these sales cycles are so long. These companies can be so slow moving, and there's so little that you as a startup can do to change that in one or two, in specific instances. And so having someone that you hire who has those relationships is so key.
Exactly. So those existing relationships in sales are key. Our next question is about, an example would be, last night I watched a movie on carbon removal that was showcasing called Legion 44. And that's a good example. If you were, advising today a climate founder who's just starting off, right, in a hardware company, so carbon removal would be a good example, what would be like 3 non-obvious lessons that you would want to share with that founder, with everything you've learned at KKR, at World Fund, and more? Like, what would be some non-obvious lessons to share with that founder?
I don't know if these are non-obvious, but a couple of things I'll say is understand your cap table. It sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many technical founders outsource this or say, oh, well, I'm the technical founder, I don't need to deal with that. You're the business founder, you organize that. Like, you need to understand your cap table, because if your cap table isn't structured properly, it can create difficulties for you down the line that can result in your company failing. Like, it can make fundraising very, very difficult if the cap table is messy. You need to make sure you're being strategic and that you're partnering with the right investors at the right stage for you. Otherwise, it may make it more difficult for you later on. So I'd say, be the technical founder. I love that. I'm an engineer as well. Like, technical skills are so important, but you have to understand the cap table. Second thing I'd say is don't grow too fast, is what I said earlier, but you do have to then prioritize hiring key people when it's right. And so especially for ops or for sales, I see sometimes people are waiting to hire until they need them yesterday. And then in Europe, in my experience, hiring can't go that fast. So you do have to try to have that longer term perspective of, if I know I need a commercial director in 6 months, I need to start hiring today. And that's, I think keeping that long-term vision while balancing the putting out immediate fires, it's really hard to balance. But I think it's really key. And then I'd say leverage your board. I think that's obvious, but I see a lot of boards where connections and support and knowledge is not necessarily leveraged. I think founders view boards as someone they have to manage versus partners sometimes. And so I would say partner with your board, be strategic about who goes on the board, and then leverage their expertise.
And you touched on messy, how do you call them? Sorry.
Cap table.
Cap tables, thank you. What does it look like? If you could walk us through seed stage, a messy cap table, Series A, a messy cap table, like how many investors are we talking about? What does messy or clean look like at various stages?
Yeah, I mean, often it can also be alternative funding, like it's not even just number of investors, but we see sometimes that founders have gone to an accelerator, or they've gone to a nonprofit, or they've taken some kind of money and they've given away an amount of value that makes it difficult. I mean, so one, the founders need to retain value, like there's norms around what we want founders to have skin in the game. And there's also rules we want to see around value for future rounds, and also for VSOP and for employees, and we want people to be incentivized. And if you give away too much value early, especially with some of these accelerator programs or some of these very early stage investors, then it can mean there's very little of the pie left later on, and that can make it very difficult.
Do you have a rule of thumb, or is it more on a case by case?
I mean, there's standard rules of thumb. I think it also varies on the stage you're looking at and the industry you're looking at. But generally, we want the founders to be keeping meaningful amounts of shares for a very long time.
Wonderful. And so what are you thinking after this role? Are you thinking you're going to keep doing impact for other funds? Or what excites you right now in climate tech? Where do you see the future, and where do you want to be yourself?
I mean, I'm very happy where I am, so hoping to stay here for a long time. But no, I mean, I think what's really interesting is this growth and scaling aspect of climate tech. I think historically and right now, a lot of the most interesting work has been at the very early stage, because that's where the solutions were. But I think we're seeing a lot of solutions start to graduate from that very early, pilot seed stage into real equity, growth equity, functioning businesses. And so I think seeing that over the next couple of years is going to be super, super exciting as we watch climate tech kind of grow up and go up the pipeline. So seeing, we saw this with renewables go from early stage, innovative, and now it's in infra, and it's an infra play, and most VCs wouldn't touch it because it's not innovative from our standards anymore. And so I'm excited to see what technologies we can push up that growth curve.
Oh, it's beautiful to remember where solar was and where solar is. As you said you don't consider it as innovation anymore?
Not
it's so established?
Not just solar panel production. It has to be innovative or novel in some way.
Oh, wow. That's pretty good news. Well, Morgan, thank you so much. This was super insightful. You go. Next on stage, I'm going to be, two men are going to be joining me soon. One is based in the UK, one in Italy, and they're both very active in supporting founders and investors. One works for an alliance of investors, and he's an entrepreneur himself. And then the other one is chief scientist of a very large foundation that has deployed more than $1 billion. So I'm excited to welcome them both on stage. And we're going to be talking more about the ecosystem that is required to get climate tech companies to scale. So, right now you've had the more entrepreneurial perspective, the policy perspective with Paul and Paulina. And then we went more into the impact journey from a more of an investor perspective on how to scale big climate tech companies and impact companies. And now we're going to look more what is required in the ecosystem, not just from an investor and startup perspective, but from the entire ecosystem. Are we almost ready? Yes. Okay. We'll wait for the music this time. Okay, we like the sound of that. So I'm excited to welcome on stage Guillaume de Dorlodot and Greg de Temmerman. So I know Guillaume and Greg, you've been listening to the conversation from the back. I saw you, Guillaume. So I just want to introduce you both. So Guillaume is a serial entrepreneur and adventurer. He's co-founder and CEO of Climate Investor Alliance. He's also co-founder and CEO of startup Basecamp. He's also co-founded Nomad Pass. He's obviously a serial entrepreneur. He's built a lot. He's done a lot. He's passionate about climate and innovation and investing. So we're very excited to hear his perspective today. And Greg, who's a physicist and energy expert. He has a background at ITER, and he's now managing director at the Quadrature Climate Foundation, which is a very large foundation that has committed more than 1 billion in grants over 180 organizations in 17 countries. Thank you so much for joining me today. My first question would actually be for Guillaume. So looking at pre-IPO climate tech companies, we're looking at companies that are going to hopefully IPO soon, like DeepKey, Sunfire, or Ineratech. And each obviously very heavy infrastructure plays. What are kind of common ingredients that you see in terms of in a playbook to be able to scale these companies so that what happened to Northvolt doesn't happen to them? With your experience as an entrepreneur, what would you have to share with us?
Thank you everyone for being here. I mean, this is an amazing question. What's the playbook? And I think everybody is still figuring out what is the right playbook.
Can everybody hear him?
Can you hear me well?
Yeah, cool.
Fantastic.
Just checking.
Thanks for the doubt. So what I was mentioning is like this playbook is really like the golden grail that everybody is trying to figure it out as of today. Because if you remember well, venture capital, financing, startups were all about SaaS and software. Today, in the climate tech world, 90% of companies are definitely hardware-based solutions with deep science involved, which creates a little bit of like friction on the venture side model. So what we realize is like you have these early stage investments that companies like the World Fund are coming to support. But then the journey, it's only the start, because you need to continue to de-risk the technology. And further down, you're going to need to build a plant. You're going to need to build the hardware. And that's where you start to see like difference happening between the companies. Some are looking for business models that are like asset light. Some will need assets, more heavy infrastructure to be able to execute. And when you look at that, you realize that the journey needs to be prepared upfront. So we at the Climate Investor Alliance start to work with companies usually early stage or Series A, not early, but Series A. It helps to have already, I would say, the technology starting to be de-risked and being worked in lab for a long time. And at that time, ventures start to put capital to help to grow the team. And as the previous speaker was saying, and I forgot her name, I'm sorry about that, she was mentioning that also the important role is really to have this team in place that will look forward through the different funding rounds to start to build the commercial traction that you need. So how are you going to get connected to the right person in the right corporate? And I think that's something very important, more than just developing and de-risking your technology in itself. You need to start to think the path forward. So on one side is like where and how I'm going to start to build my sales cycle. On the other side is also how I'm going to finance that infrastructure that I will need. And most of the climate tech, again, as we said, needs that infrastructure financing. Today, infrastructure investors are there to start to support, but you still have a gap, what we call the first of a kind. Infrastructure investors, historically, have been in business to not lose money. So for them, it's a big change. Venture investors always have been put like bet on the table, realizing that maybe 3 to 4 companies out of the portfolio, if they perform well, will succeed and will wipe out all the loss that they did. Today is different. When we reach commercialization, you need to have invested a lot of capital upfront. So this whole journey requires a lot of like different, I would say, stakeholders to put on the table. And people like Greg are very important with foundation. You need catalytic capital as well that can help to de-risk the final envelopes that will allow you to start commercialization. But I think there's more to do, and I could speak like probably very long on that, so maybe you have another question.
No, absolutely. I mean, thank you for touching upon that. We're going to dive more into that in a second, and it's great to hear your experience and what's needed from a catalytic capital perspective. Greg, you've been at the head of this foundation, co-head, right? And what have you seen in terms of, you've delivered a lot of grants, you're going to do way more. Could you walk us through some examples of what you've seen in the last few years that you've been working on this?
Yeah, so just to remember what we do, we are a foundation, so we provide grants, we don't invest. We have philanthropic capital, which is very interesting because it doesn't expect any return, which means it can be extremely patient, but at the same time take a lot of risk. So we have the freedom to basically do anything we think has some impact. We are really interested in where can we both de-risk things, but also create the conditions which can make innovation emerge. Because in the climate tech space, we are in a very specific space of innovation where you're trying to replace something which is emitting CO2. So think steel, cement, whatever you can think of, transportation. So you have to go and compete with a market which is really big and well established. And in many cases, what you come up with is something which is more expensive than the fossil fuel alternative, and sometimes even less efficient. So you need to be able to have either market conditions which allow you to actually compete, or some people willing to put a green premium, or some kind of mechanisms which actually level the play field. And that can't be done by investors. So that's where we intervene. We do a lot of advocacy, trying to create regulations, trying to make sure people understand the risks of scaling that, because it's going to be hard also. You're talking about scale. If you want to go on the steel market those days, it's 2 billion tons of steel being produced every year. So you really have to go at scale. And you also want to scale because that's what allows you to decrease the cost. So what we are seeing is a lot of the ecosystem has been changing a lot since 21, 22. A lot of startups came out during that time. Money was more or less free on the market. There was a lot of investment. I think capital is a bit harder to find, but I don't think capital is really the problem now. The problem is the perceived risk. And also, in many cases, the lack of regulations or the lack of market conditions. Think about carbon removal. There is no economic value in trying to get some CO2 from the atmosphere and putting it somewhere. So unless you have a market mechanism, whether it's compliance or voluntary, people won't do that by themselves. So you need to be able to provide rules or kind of incentives for people to actually do something. And we see things moving that way, where more and more you have companies which are getting to the stage where they can become commercial, but their product is expensive and they need people to help them create the market or buy something. So where we can also intervene is doing a lot of supporting partners which are creating buyers alliance, for example, trying to make sure that small buyers can actually group and buy a product and try to take the premium, because the name of the game right now in climate tech is learning rate, right? How quickly can you decrease your costs with your production volume? But that means you need the production volume, so you need to get that circle going so that you can actually get competitive.
So Greg, essentially you're building a market in a sense, because you're going in early in markets that are kind of non-existent, and you're putting that first risky capital to really move the needle before, basically to unlock private capital.
So we are not doing anything. We are financing people to do something. Let's be clear. That's what we do. Yeah, we try to see where philanthropic capital can actually help things. So we don't do, for example, catalytic capital in Europe because we don't think it's the best thing for us to do, but we do it in Africa because there the cost of capital is really high. So if you have a bit of money which is willing to take all the risk and none of the profits, then you can start getting costs down. But we are financing a lot of think tanks or groups of people thinking of different topics, people doing some campaigning to actually get basically governments to step up in some cases. And in some cases, just investors understand that perhaps the risks are not as high as they seem to be. I think that's what you mentioned. There is a bit of a perceived risk in many things where people are like, oh, that's new. We don't know whether there's a market. And we funded a lot of, just advanced market commitment mechanisms where people basically buy and they agree to actually pay a much higher price at the beginning. And then you create the conditions for then startups to say, look, my order book is actually full, so can I get the funding? So that's what we are doing is basically, the way I describe it most of the times is we are some grease in the wheel. We are just trying to oil a bit the mechanism, which can turn a bit faster, hopefully.
Well, it's a very important role, especially in climate tech, especially today. So I'm glad to hear that there's foundations like yours that are actually taking that risk and putting in that capital. A question for Guillaume. At the Climate Investor Alliance, you work with family offices, right? Can you tell us about an example where you've worked with a family to make an opportunity happen? What were the important tipping points where you were there, to support the company, and some examples that you could share with us?
So we have the chance to collaborate with many family offices and growing. And what we noticed, it's like often those family offices are, families that have been in business for 100 years with different legacy businesses. And what we notice today, it's like sometimes these entrepreneurial fibers that in a way built their families and the wealth that they have access to today, start to be a little bit eroded by the fear of risk. The fear sometimes of this unknown, why this status quo needs to change today, why this company will eventually succeed in the future. And the most important part of it, through the different conversation that we have with them, climate tech in general and impact can be still seen as the philanthropy action of their wealth that they will distribute. And today is not the case anymore. If you look at climate tech, we are talking about the refinancing of, or the financing of this reindustrialization of the economy. I mean, you hear Donald Trump speaking about we need to bring back factories and jobs in the US. But in a way, thanks to him, and I hate to say that, we realize today that there is opportunities to really redesign the industrial landscape of our countries. And not by putting many workers behind the assembly line. It's really how can we redesign and rethink the way we build stuff, the way we process also all of those factories. And families, looking at that, trying to understand and starting to understand and get educated that the opportunity is also there in terms of financial return with impact. If you present them the opportunity as we are building indeed a company that will create return at scale, and if they succeed, we will have an impact as well on the climate crisis in itself, so decarbonization and so on and so forth. And I think that's very interesting for them, is really to always show them at first that there is a real opportunity to really redefine the way our industry, our economy works, and at the same time that we will have a sustainable impact and create this legacy that they are looking at as well. So for us, it's we took this more macro approach and really working with venture fund, early stage, Series A, that invest in those companies. We have a network of scientists that helps us also to understand the technology, because again, climate tech is a huge umbrella with so many different subcategories and deep science involved. And working, as we were mentioning before, to the success of the growing and scaling those new industries, you need to work also with entry gate within the different industries. So we work with large partners and large firms that have access to the different corporate that can help those companies to get in front of the right corporate at the right time, in terms of starting to engage a conversation for their pilot project. From their pilot project, they will go to an offtake agreement eventually. And then, therefore, they will be in the right position to go to finance their infrastructure in itself that will help them to build these production assets that is needed to go to market and expand. So families are, I think, super important to involved inside of this ecosystem, because this long-term view that they have on deployment of capital, their legacy business eventually, their connection within the financial world, all of that capital and those resources are very key and important to help to really finance this reindustrialization of our economy.
Thank you, Guillaume. Wonderful. So yeah, working with families is very important, as we know, and we're very grateful for the work you're doing. Greg, I would love to hear an example. Of course, at Change Now, we like to hear about stories, about examples, about concrete stories that you have to share the important work you're doing. So, Greg, we know you're committed to deploying 1 billion over 180 organizations in 17 countries. Could you tell us a bit about some grantees that went really well, others maybe less well, to kind of bring all of this to life?
It's like choosing which one is your favorite baby. I think related to the discussion today, I think 2 examples of things which we are really proud of. One is an innovation in insurance. So we supported Climate Resilience for All, which prototyped a system of parametric insurance in India. The principle is simple. Many women work in India in the fields. When it's too hot, it's too dangerous for them to work. If they can't go out to work, they don't get paid. And then if they don't get paid for a few days, they fall into extreme poverty because they're already extremely poor. So the principle is they pay a very small subsidy. They get a bank account. Anytime the temperature goes above 40 degrees and they can't go to work, the insurance is triggered automatically. So we financed the prototyping on 50,000 women. It worked well to the point that Swiss Re is now looking at industrializing it. So it's very interesting for us because it's a couple of millions, a year of experimentation, and now it's taking off. The second one is we funded something called Allied Climate Partners, which is a catalytic capital fund in Africa, where we support the beginning of a project, so project feasibility studies that nobody really wants to actually do. Once they get there, they can actually start raising money. So it's interesting because it's really for us the part where nobody else wants to take the risk. It doesn't cost so much money at the end of the day, but then you unlock hundreds of millions. In terms of things which don't go well, it's pretty...
Just a question, do you fund, is it mostly startups, foundations, or funds, or all of the above?
In that one, it's a fund, basically,
Okay.
but we fund the entrepreneurs of the project, people at the very beginning, when they think about a wind farm, a solar farm in Africa, people have to do the engineering studies at the beginning, and that's what we fund, so that basically investors can get comfortable with the project. In terms of things which don't work well, we tend to say that anything we fund actually has an effect in the world. The question is whether this is the effect we expected or not. What we have seen is there are things which have been much more difficult than we expected, like the carbon market, for example. We have done a lot of support on the carbon removal market, trying to create compliance markets. It's working well. There are things going really well, but it's really hard to get states, basically, or countries to actually commit. And that's because they have different priorities and so on. That's a very complicated thing, and then there are a lot of technicalities. So I think it's one where we knew it was going to be difficult, and indeed it is taking a lot of time for carbon removal technologies to get anywhere at this stage.
Wonderful. Well, last night I attended a great movie on carbon removal, which I highly recommend, called Legion 144, where we learn a lot about all the various ways of doing carbon removal, which is it's much more than you'd think. So it's super, super interesting sector that I highly recommend learning about. And so, Greg, you talk a little bit about, so actually a good segue into carbon removal. We discussed there's over 500 startups that do carbon removal globally. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing there that is interesting, that you think is going to move the needle?
Difficult question. So first of all, carbon removal, usually when you talk about that, people think about direct air capture, so those big fans and big machines which are pumping CO2 out of the air, which is one of the very many ways you can do it. So carbon removal is actually an interesting plethora of technologies or techniques, actually, because some of them are really not high-tech, right? It's kind of grinding rocks, spraying it on soils and getting carbon in. So it's interesting because there has been a boom, mainly because of the IPCC last 2 reports, which showed that if you want to go to net zero, you have to get in negative terms. So you have to decrease emission as quickly as possible. But at the end of the day, some emissions will always remain, and you have to compensate for them. So that's kind of what drove a lot of the market. A lot of startups went into it. What we see is that the technologies are coming there, but there are big bottlenecks, which are, how do you actually certify that the carbon you have removed from the atmosphere is stored for a long period of time and it's not leaking out of the atmosphere? So that's what people call MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. It sounds simple, but in many cases, it's actually pretty complicated and it's quite scientific question. So we see that there's still a lot of research needed to actually get those certificates or those ways of certifying the market up and running. The other one is, again, there is no economic value of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Pumping oil out of the ground, burning it and emitting CO2 has a lot of economic value. We have done that for 150 years. The opposite has no value. So it's a bit like taking out your garbage. Unless there is something which forces you to have a structure which collects your garbage, recycles it as much as possible, then nothing can happen. So there's been a lot of work on voluntary carbon market, trying to make sure that people do it on their own. And you can do that if you have large revenues or large profits. Like Microsoft can buy a lot of carbon credits at really high price because they do a lot of profit. A steel company working right on the margin of profit is not going to do that. And Microsoft doesn't emit much. A steel mill does emit a lot. So you need a mechanism where people are going to be forced. So that's part of the carbon market. Europe is trying to discuss how to integrate carbon removal into the ETS, the European Trading Scheme. But there are a lot of complexity in how to get there. So I think it's one of those where, on paper, yeah, you want to scale that to gigatons per year, but it's a long way to go. And the interesting thing is there are so many techniques being applied. You can't pick a winner. You probably need all of them or most of them. So you need to kind of try and hold things together. Some things will fail and just create the right conditions for it to emerge.
Right, and that's another industry that we need to create, right? We need to create the incentives, we need to create the market. Last night in the movie we saw, initially when you think about carbon capture, I just thought about these big fans sucking out carbon out of the atmosphere, but actually it has to do also with biomass, with seaweed, with the soil. I mean, there's just so much. So it's a very exciting vertical. Wonderful. Well, a few last quick questions. What keeps you up at night? Easy one to finish.
Electricity prices. I think one thing which is critical in Europe, at least, if we want all those startups to succeed, most of them are going to be relying on electricity. A lot of them are really energy intensive. Electricity prices in Europe right now are like 3 times higher than in the US. I live in the UK, it's even worse. And it's all about market design. So we are seeing more and more a gap between cost of technologies. So renewables are getting cheaper and cheaper on a cost basis. Prices are not decreasing for customers. And that is leading to a lot of pushback, to the point that some parties in France want to actually dismount wind turbines. So I think for me, it's one of those kind of things that people don't really want to talk about. But if you really want a strong industry in Europe, you have to get something done on the electricity price. And that has to do with market design, which means regulation in its governments. So that we fund a lot of work and advocacy for governments to actually step up to the plate and say, look, it's nice to say you're going to invest in those companies. If they can't be cost competitive because electricity price is so high, then nothing can happen.
Yeah, energy prices is a big one. What about you, Guillaume?
So besides my 2 young kids, for me it's really like, how can we really accelerate the capital deployment, those trillions of dollars sitting on the sideline, and really accelerate them towards those climate tech companies that are really building and redesigning the way how we build and produce things. So it's really like putting as much as possible those families, capital allocator, foundations, catalytic capitals, the European Investment Bank, all of those actors are on the table to really funnel that capital that is needed. I mean, we need 3.5 trillion euros or USD on a yearly basis to hopefully reach this net zero by 2050, which probably will be by a little bit later than that. So that's what keeps me at night.
Wonderful. And last question, why do you come to Change now?
I was going to say because I was invited. But I think it's interesting because there's a lot of things happening. I mean, it's easy when you work on climate to actually look at the negative things, and climate is changing really quickly, and impacts are really increasing extremely fast. So it's really bad. But at the same thing, there's so much going on. And the interesting thing always to me is that we get used to that. Batteries is probably the kind of breakthrough technology we have had in the last 10 years. And then we get used to them. And then we are looking after the next thing. So I think it's interesting to see all those people trying to change things. And at the same time, sometimes stepping out and saying, things are happening, not fast enough, as Guillaume just said, unfortunately, but things are still happening.
Exactly, and it's good to look back, see everything we've achieved, right? If you look at solar 10 years ago and solar today, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, the previous speaker said it, don't consider it as an innovation anymore, it's a solar panel, because we know how to do it now. What about you? Why do you come to Change now?
Because it feels good to be surrounded by all of those innovators and people who are really like looking to build a better world, more sustainable. And it feels good to be all together and see that we're all putting so much time and effort to make it work. And it's still a bubble, unfortunately. So I will encourage all of you to keep doing what you do and speaking and spreading the words that indeed we can change it now.
Wonderful. So hopefully we can grow the bubble and make it the status quo. Thank you.